The song broke Robert Covington the moment he heard it. He had been riding the fence line of the east pasture, checking for the breaks his foreman had reported at dawn, his mind churning with the numbers that kept him awake most nights: the debt to the cattlemen's bank in Tucson, the drought that had thinned his herd by a third, the whispered threats from Dalton Briggs, who wanted the Covington land badly enough to do ugly things to get it. His horse, a big roan gelding named Cormac, had gone still without any instruction from Robert, ears pricked forward toward the cluster of cottonwood trees that screened the widow Harmon's property from his own. And then he heard it. A woman's voice, clear and unhurried, threading through the dry Arizona air like water running over smooth rock. She was not performing. She was not even aware she had an audience. She was simply singing to herself, the way people do when they believe the world has gone elsewhere and left them alone with their own hearts. The song was not one he recognized at first. It was low and aching, something about a river and a man who never came back from it. And the way she shaped the melody made it feel less like a song and more like a confession, like something that lived inside her and could only come out when no one was watching. Robert sat very still on Cormac's back and did not breathe too loudly and did not move, because he was afraid that if she heard him, she would stop, and he was not ready for that. He could see her through the gaps in the cottonwood leaves. She was hanging laundry on the line that stretched between two rough wooden posts in the side yard of the old Harmon house, which had stood empty for 6 months before someone had quietly rented it 3 weeks ago. He had not met the new tenant. He had heard through Bess McCready at the general store that a woman had come alone from back east, a widow from Missouri, and that she kept to herself. He had not thought much of it at the time because his own troubles had been too loud inside his skull, but now he thought of nothing else. She moved between the basket and the line with a natural, unself-conscious grace, shaking out each garment before pinning it, never missing a note, never stumbling over the words even when the melody grew complicated. The morning sun was full on her face when she turned, and Robert saw dark hair pinned loosely at the nape of her neck, a few strands loose and blowing against her cheek, and brown eyes that were looking at nothing and everything at once the way people's eyes do when they are lost inside their own music. He stayed for 11 minutes. He counted them, because counting felt like the only solid thing available to him. When she finally reached the end of her basket and unpinned the last corner of the last piece and took it back inside, the silence she left behind was the loudest thing Robert Covington had ever heard. He turned Cormac around and rode back toward his own land and did not tell anyone what he had heard. But he thought about it every hour for the next 3 days, which told him something he did not particularly want to know. Her name was Elvira Holloway. He learned it the way he learned most things in Redemption Creek, Arizona, through Bess McCready, who knew everything about everyone within 40 miles of town, and told it all freely as long as you were willing to listen to her opinions on your own affairs in return. He had ridden in to pick up a parcel of fencing wire that Wednesday, and Bess had been in the middle of a sentence when he walked through the door. "That Mrs. Holloway is a hard worker, I will say that for her," Bess was saying to Tom Aldridge, the schoolteacher, who nodded politely over his own parcel. "Planted a kitchen garden already, can you imagine? 3 weeks off the stage and she has got beans coming up. She came in for seeds and I asked her where she was from and she said Missouri, but she said it the way people say a word they are still deciding whether they mean." Robert pretended to study his fencing wire order while he listened. "What's her story?" Tom asked. "Widow. Husband died," she said, but she did not say more than that and her face said not to ask. "She's got a voice like church music. I heard her humming while she was looking at the calico. Quiet woman, polite. Pays in coin. I like her." Robert paid for his wire and went home and thought about a voice like church music and brown eyes fixed on something far away, and he made himself stop thinking about it, because he had 37 problems that were more pressing than a neighbor he had never spoken to. What pushed him over the line was not calculation. It was a Tuesday. He had a basket of late summer squash from his own kitchen garden that Rosa, his housekeeper of 11 years, had declared excessive. And Rosa had said someone ought to take some of it to the new neighbor, because waste was a sin and loneliness was a worse one. Rosa was not a woman who gave her opinions quietly, and Robert had found over the years that arguing with her cost more than it was worth. So he loaded 6 squash into a cloth sack, and he rode over to the Harmon property on a Tuesday morning with his hat clean and his jaw shaved closer than it needed to be just to bring a neighbor some vegetables, which he recognized was ridiculous and did not acknowledge to anyone including himself. He knocked on the front door. She answered it in a blue calico dress with flower on her left wrist, and a look in her brown eyes that said she had been interrupted mid-task and was deciding whether to be annoyed by it. Up close she was perhaps 28, maybe 29, with fine bones and a quality of stillness about her that reminded him of a landscape just before weather changes, everything held, everything waiting. There was a small scar above her right eyebrow, fine and old, and her hands when she wiped the flour on her apron were strong and competent. "Mr. Covington," she said, and he was startled because he had not introduced himself yet. "I see my reputation precedes me," he said. Something moved through her eyes that might have been amusement. "Bess Macready described you fairly accurately. 6 feet, dark hair starting to go silver at the temples, looks like he carries the weight of several counties on his shoulders." "She's not wrong," he said. He held out the cloth sack. "My housekeeper sent these. We had more squash than sense." Elvira Holloway looked at the squash the way a person looks at something they are grateful for but uncertain about accepting. Then she took the bag. "Tell her thank you," she said. "Would you like to come in for coffee? I have it on." He had not expected the invitation. He said yes before he thought about whether he should. The inside of the Harmon house was cleaner and more organized than he had ever seen it, even when old Jonas Harmon had been alive. She had a reading chair pulled close to the window, and there was a stack of books on the small table beside it, real books, not almanacs or seed catalogs. He caught the spines. A volume of Emerson, something with a French title he could not read from where he stood, and what looked like a medical text. On the kitchen table, rolled out flat and weighted at the corners with smooth stones, was a piece of paper covered in her handwriting. "Sit anywhere," she said, and went to the stove. He sat at the kitchen table and did not read her papers, though he wanted to, because reading someone's private writing without permission was the kind of thing his mother had taught him not to do, and he had not forgotten. He watched her instead, the way she moved in her own kitchen, efficient, practiced, none of the self-consciousness people sometimes show when they have a stranger in their house. She moved like a woman who had been taking care of herself for long enough that it no longer required thought. She set 2 cups on the table and sat across from him and looked at him directly in the way that most people in the West did not do, particularly women with men they did not know, and it unsettled him pleasantly. "How long have you had the Covington spread?" she asked. "Born on it. My father built the house in 1861. He came out from Tennessee." He wrapped both hands around the cup. The coffee was better than his own. "And you're from Missouri?" "Born in St. Louis. Married and moved to Hannibal. Widowed and moved here." She said it matter-of-factly, but the same quality he had heard in Bess's account was there, the words placed in a specific order that revealed the shape of the information without revealing its substance. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said. "Thank you," she said, and meant it, he thought, but moved on quickly. "What's the land like between your spread and the creek? I've been thinking about whether I could run a few chickens on the south side." He told her about the land, and she asked good questions, and the coffee cups emptied, and an hour passed without either of them noticing it particularly, which was the most comfortable Robert Covington had felt in any hour since before his own wife had died 2 years ago, a fact he had not expected to think about in this context. He noticed it and filed it carefully away. When he left, she stood in the doorway and watched him go, and he did not look back, though he wanted to, and he told himself very firmly that this was just a neighbor and a courtesy call, and that was all it needed to be. He was lying, and he knew it. Rosa knew it too. He could tell by the way she did not ask a single question when he came home 40 minutes later than expected, only moved around the kitchen with an expression of careful innocence that was more suspicious than any question would have been. "The squash was welcome," he said. "Good," Rosa said, and kept her back to him, and he could hear that she was smiling. The real trouble began with Dalton Briggs. Robert had known Dalton for 15 years, which was long enough to understand the man's particular shape of ambition, wide and flat and patient, like a stone plate that spreads under pressure rather than shattering. Dalton owned the Briggs Cattle Company east of town and had been making quiet arrangements to expand westward for 3 years now, which meant acquiring the properties that stood between him and the open grazing land near Coyote Ridge. The Covington spread was the largest and most valuable of those properties, and Dalton had made 2 formal offers for it in the past 18 months, both politely declined. The informal pressure was less polite. Robert's fence lines had been cut 4 times in the past year. 2 of his ranch hands had quit abruptly after what they described only as a conversation they did not want to discuss further. A small brush fire had started suspiciously close to his south barn in June, and had been caught in time only because his top hand, a steady Mexican man named Ernesto Salazar, had been awake with a sick horse. Robert had no proof of any of it, and proof mattered in a territory where the law was thin and the distances between men were wide. He had kept most of this from Elvira Holloway because she was not his problem to put his problems on. But 3 weeks after the squash delivery, she appeared at his front gate on foot in the early morning with a clean expression and a tin of cookies, and a look that said she had come with a purpose. "Your foreman's wife told me you've been having trouble with your east fence line," she said, when Rosa had brought her in and produced tea and disappeared with the satisfaction of someone who has arranged things to their liking. "Mrs. Salazar has a generous mouth," Robert said, though without any real irritation. "She's worried about you, so I am told." Elvira set the tin on the table between them. "I saw 2 men on horseback along that fence line yesterday afternoon. They weren't your men. I know your men by now, at least to recognize. These 2 were strangers. They stopped for a while and looked at the wire and then rode off south." Robert set down his coffee cup very carefully. "What time?" 3 o'clock, maybe a quarter past. "Can you describe them?" She could. She was precise and detailed in a way that surprised him: the color of their horses, the style of their hats, the fact that one of them rode with his left stirrup slightly higher than his right as if he had an old injury, the direction they came from and the direction they went. She described it all flatly and factually, like a woman who had learned that accurate information is more valuable than dramatic impression. "That's very good," he said, meaning it. "I taught school for 2 years," she said. "You train yourself to observe children closely enough, you get good at watching people in general." He had not known she was a teacher. He stored it carefully alongside everything else he knew about her, which was more than he had known about many people he had known for years. "I need to ask you something," he said. "Ask." "What were you doing watching my east fence line at 3 in the afternoon?" A small pause. Color moved very slightly under her cheekbones. "I walk in the afternoon. I go that direction sometimes. The cottonwood shade is good." He understood suddenly that the cottonwood shade was along the same line where he had heard her singing. He understood also that she walked there sometimes and had not until now mentioned it, which meant she had made some decision about what she was telling him and what she was keeping. He did not press it. He filed it away. "Thank you," he said, "for telling me." "Be careful, Robert," she said, and then looked very slightly startled at herself for using his Christian name without apparent invitation, and he felt something warm and unsteady open in the center of his chest. "I will," he said. "Elvira." She looked at him for one moment with an expression he could not entirely read but wanted very much to. And then she looked down at her tea, and they both pretended to be concerned with their cups for a moment before finding safer ground in talk of her kitchen garden and the first beans she had actually harvested. After she left, Rosa came in from whatever she had been pretending to do in the back of the house and picked up the tin of cookies, and examined them with professional interest. "She bakes well," Rosa said. "Does she?" said Robert, who had eaten 3 and agreed completely. "She likes you," Rosa said. "She brought cookies to be neighborly." "She walked 40 minutes each direction in August heat in Arizona to bring you cookies and tell you about 2 men on your fence line," Rosa said patiently, "because she has been paying attention to your land and your troubles since before you even knew her name. That is not neighborly, Roberto. That is something else." Robert did not answer. Rosa put the cookies down and went back to her work, and he sat in his kitchen for a while and thought about dark hair blowing against a woman's cheek, and a voice that had come through cottonwood leaves on a still morning and broken something open in him that he had thought was closed for good. The men on the fence line were Briggs's men. He confirmed it through Ernesto, who knew most of the riders in the county by sight, and who identified them from Elvira's description as 2 drifters Briggs had been seen hiring in the spring. Robert rode into Redemption Creek and had a conversation with the county sheriff, a good-natured but cautious man named Walt Purvis, who listened carefully and wrote some notes and told Robert he would look into it, which they both understood meant not very much would happen immediately without evidence. What did happen was that Robert began to see the scope of what Briggs was building against him. It was not just fence gutting. It was a designed campaign to make the Covington spread unprofitable and Robert unpopular and ultimately ungovernable as an independent operation. The bank debt was part of it, Robert learned, through a friend of a friend who worked at the Cattlemen's Bank, that Briggs had been in conversation with the bank manager about the terms of Robert's loan, the due dates, the penalties for late payment. Briggs was positioning himself to catch Robert at a financial low point and make an offer that would feel like rescue. Robert sat with this for 2 days and did not sleep well either night. On the 3rd day he went to see Elvira. He did not plan it. He was riding past on other business, and then he was not, and he was standing at her front gate with no squash and no excuse. She was in the kitchen garden on the south side of the house, on her knees in the dirt, and she looked up when she heard the gate and did not look surprised to see him, which surprised him. "I need to think out loud," he said, "and Rosa has heard it all already." Elvira sat back on her heels and pulled off her gardening gloves and looked at him. "Come and sit," she said, and nodded at the rough bench she had placed near the garden, and he tied Cormac to the fence post and went and sat. He told her almost everything. The fence gutting, the bank conversations, the brush fire, the hands who had quit. He told her about Briggs and what the man wanted and how long he had been building toward it. He told her about the debt, which he had not told anyone outside his own household. He told her that he had 3,700 acres of the best grazing land in that part of the Arizona territory, and that he had no intention of surrendering a single inch of it, but that the ground was being cut from under him in ways he could not fight with a fence line and a rifle. Elvira listened to all of it without interrupting. She put her gloves on her knee and looked at the middle distance and let him talk, and when he was done she was quiet for a moment and then she said, "How much is the loan?" he told her. "And when is the payment due?" "November 1st. She was quiet again. He watched her think, which was something to watch. She did it visibly, methodically, the way a person does when they are actually working a problem rather than performing concern. "My husband left me money," she said, "more than I need here." "I could no," he said immediately. She looked at him. "I haven't finished. The answer is no regardless. I am not taking money from you. I wasn't offering a gift. I was going to propose a loan at whatever rate the bank charges you to be repaid on the same schedule. It would simply mean Briggs couldn't use the bank against you." She paused. "The difference is that I am not trying to steal your land." He looked at her for a long moment. "Why would you do that?" She held his gaze and then looked away, and the color came back to her cheekbones, and she said, "Because you are a good man who is being treated unjustly, and because I have the means to help, and because standing by when you have the means to help is a thing I have promised myself I would not do anymore." The last part carried weight he recognized as personal, something from before she came to Redemption Creek, before Missouri resolved itself in her voice to an ambivalent word. He did not ask. He accepted the weight of it and held it carefully. "I need to think about it," he said. "That's the correct answer," she said. "Don't decide today." He rode home and thought about it. And in the thinking about it, he realized something he had not admitted until then, that he trusted Elvira Holloway more than he trusted most people he had known for years, that the trust had arrived quietly and built itself without fanfare, that it was already structural, already load-bearing, the way good things sometimes are before you have noticed they were under construction. He went back 2 days later and told her yes. She got out a piece of paper and they sat at her kitchen table and worked out the terms together, plainly and practically. And when it was done, she shook his hand across the table and her grip was firm, and her eyes were direct, and he held on for 1 beat longer than was required by the handshake, and then let go. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me," she said. "Just keep your land." He kept the secret of the loan from most people, because the loan's power as a defense against Briggs depended on Briggs not knowing Robert had an alternative financial arrangement. Only Ernesto knew, because Ernesto had to know the ranch's financial situation to do his job, and because Ernesto was constitutionally incapable of gossip. Bess McCready did not know. Sheriff Purvis did not know. Robert wanted it clean and quiet until November 1st had passed. What could not be kept quiet was the fact that he was going to see Elvira Holloway with some regularity, and that this could not be entirely explained by neighborliness and squash. Bess McCready noticed within a week. She did not say anything direct because she was too skilled for that. She simply had a way of looking at Robert when he came in for supplies, a particular expression of contained satisfaction, as if a story she had been waiting for was finally beginning to move. Tom Aldridge noticed too, and was more straightforward about it. "Mrs. Holloway is a remarkable woman," Tom said, leaning against the post office wall on a Thursday afternoon when Robert had come to collect his mail. "She is," Robert said, meaning only to be polite, and then hearing how he had said it and understanding from Tom's expression that the tone had been unmistakably warm. "She mentioned you to me," Tom said, "when she came to look at the schoolhouse in case they needed a second teacher in the spring. She said you had been very kind to her since she arrived." Tom paused deliberately. "She said it the way people say things when they mean considerably more than the words." Robert folded his mail under his arm and looked at Tom for a moment. Tom was a good man, careful and decent, and was not saying this to meddle but to offer something. "She's been through something hard," Robert said, "back in Missouri." "So have you," Tom said simply. "Seems like that might be something you have in common." Robert walked home thinking about dark secrets and shared weight and whether sorrow, when it is not competed over but held side by side, becomes something different from what it was alone. He asked her about Missouri one evening in late September when they were sitting on her porch in the cooling air after a supper she had cooked that was better than anything he could produce himself. He had brought a bottle of wine, actual wine, which he had ordered from the general store weeks ago in anticipation of an occasion he had not quite named. They were on their second glasses and the sun was going copper-red over the ridge and she had her feet tucked up under her on the porch chair the way she did when she was comfortable, and he asked it quietly because the evening asked for quiet. "What happened in Missouri?" She was still for a moment. The glass was in her hand. Then she said, "My husband's name was Gerald Holloway. He was a businessman. He seemed, when I married him, like a man of a certain kind, steady, reliable, principled. I was 24 and he was 32, and I thought I was lucky." She paused. "I was wrong. Not immediately. It took time for the true shape of him to come clear. He was a man with hidden motives in every transaction, including the marriage. He had debts he never disclosed, and a temper he never disclosed, and opinions about what a wife was for that he had also never disclosed." Robert did not speak. He waited. "He did not hit me," she said, clearly and precisely, as if she had thought carefully about which words were accurate. But he used fear the way some men use a fence to keep things where he wanted them, and he used my dependence against me. I had no income of my own, no resources, no clear way out. She turned the glass slowly between her fingers. Then he died. Heart failure, the doctor said, which was probably true, though I have thought since then that living that hard and that dishonestly could not have been good for any organ. And then there was money after all, quite a lot of it, from a business I had not known about, and I decided that I would go somewhere I could start clean. And you chose Arizona. I chose as far from Missouri as seemed reasonable, she said, and almost smiled. Arizona was a reasonable distance. The singing, he said, and then stopped himself. She looked at him. Something shifted in her expression. What about it? He had a choice here, and he knew it. He could say something vague and move on. Or he could be honest, which had a cost he could calculate and a risk he could not. He chose honest. I heard you, he said. Weeks ago, before we met, I was riding the fence line and I heard you singing by the cottonwood trees, and I stopped and I listened. You didn't know I was there. He watched her face carefully. She was very still. I should have made myself known, he said, but I didn't because I was afraid you'd stop and I wasn't ready for you to stop. The silence stretched out between them like something being measured. Then she said, what song was it? Something about a river, a man who didn't come back. She nodded slowly. My mother's song. She sang it when she thought no one could hear her too. She looked at him. I think I always knew somewhere that the song was for when I was alone. It's the truest thing I have, the thing I only do when I'm not performing anything for anyone. That's why I didn't want you to stop, he said, because it was true. She looked at him for a long time in the copper light, and he held it, that look, and did not look away or find an easier place to put his eyes. I'm not an easy woman to know, she said. I suspect you know that by now. I don't find you difficult, he said. I find you worth the work. Something moved through her face, something that was not quite tears but lived in the same neighborhood. She looked out at the ridge instead, and the sunset was saying everything that language was finding too small for. Robert, she said, and his name in her voice was different from when anyone else said it. I'm not in a hurry, he said. I want you to know that. I'm not asking for anything tonight. I'm just telling you the truth of where I am. She turned and looked at him and said, the truth of where I am is that I haven't felt safe inside my own chest in 5 years. And then I came here and planted my garden and started sleeping through the nights, and you knocked on my door with squash, and you sat at my table and talked to me like a person with a mind worth talking to. She stopped. I'm not in a hurry either, but I wanted you to know that the truth of where I am has been changing. That was enough for one evening. More than enough. He rode home under a sky full of stars, and felt something he had not felt in a very long time, the specific lightness of a man who has told the truth, and had it received with care. October came in cold and bright, the way October does in the high desert, the heat giving way suddenly, and the light changing its quality overnight from brass to silver. Robert and Elvira settled into a rhythm that was not yet defined by any formal name, but was unmistakable in its shape to anyone paying attention. He came to her on Tuesdays and Thursdays. She came to him, to the ranch, on Saturdays, ostensibly to see how the kitchen garden held up against the ranch's scale, and what she might learn for her own spring planting, actually because she was interested in the operation of it, in the cattle and the work and the particular world Robert had been born into and shaped by. She was good with the hands. That was the first thing he noticed. She did not condescend to them, and she did not pretend to be something she wasn't in their company, and she asked real questions about their work, and they responded to it. Ernesto's wife, Marisla, took to her immediately, and Elvira took to Marisla, and the two of them found a shorthand with each other that Robert observed with quiet satisfaction from a comfortable distance. She is the right shape for this place, Marisla told him, with the directness she had always applied to everything. You see it too. You have the face of a man who sees it. My face says things without my permission, Robert said. That is because it is an honest face, Marisla said. God gave you an honest face to balance out all the stubborn that came with the rest. He was also watching Dalton Briggs, which was less pleasant but no less necessary. Briggs had been quiet since September, which Robert had learned to distrust. Quiet from Briggs was not the absence of activity. It was the interval between preparations. He had Ernesto keeping watch on the east fence line, and he had told 3 of his most reliable hands to sleep in turns near the south barn, and he had sent a letter to his friend at the cattlemen's bank, explaining that he had made alternative financial arrangements for the November payment, and that any interference with those arrangements should be considered serious. He had also, with a care that came from both caution and respect for what it implied, begun making quiet inquiries about Dalton Briggs's own land records. What he found was interesting in ways that could be useful. In 1882, 6 years prior, Briggs had acquired a parcel of land in the county's eastern sector through a transaction that had some irregularities in the deed. The county records showed a gap in the chain of title. The land had transferred from its original homesteader, a man named Marcus Webb, to a holding company, and from the holding company to Briggs, but Marcus Webb's widow had never been party to any of these transactions despite being the legal heir after her husband's death. Mrs. Webb had remarried and moved to New Mexico years ago, and no one had looked too closely at the deed because Briggs was powerful and patience was useful. Robert sat with this information and thought about it carefully and then went and sat on Elvira's porch with it, because she had become the person he thought out loud to now, and she had earned that position by the quality of her thinking. "The Webb widow's name," Elvira said when he had laid it all out. "Could you find her in New Mexico?" "Probably. The county seat would have marriage records. If she never consented to the sale of that land, then Briggs's title to it is questionable at best." She was very still and very focused, which was how she looked when her mind was working at full capacity. "He's been using that land as collateral for his own business expansion. If the title is challenged, his whole financial arrangement becomes unstable," Robert said, "which gives you something to defend yourself with. That isn't just resistance, it's leverage." He looked at her with something that was partly admiration and partly something warmer than admiration. "I should have brought you into this from the beginning." "You didn't know me from the beginning," she said reasonably. "Bring me in now." They found Mrs. Webb, now Mrs. Corazon Garcia, through a combination of letters and the network of acquaintance that stretched across the territory in ways that the railroad had made faster. She was living in Santa Fe, where her new husband ran a hardware store, and when Robert's letter reached her, explaining what he had found and asking if she had ever authorized the sale of the Webb homestead land, her response came back in 2 weeks, and it was clear and emphatic. She had authorized nothing. She had never been approached. She had assumed the land had somehow reverted to county ownership after her husband's death, and had not investigated, because she had been grieving and managing 4 children, and had not had the resources to fight whatever had happened. She had still in her possession the original deed to the Webb homestead with her late husband's name on it, and no subsequent documentation signed by her hand. Robert read this letter 3 times. Then he took it to Sheriff Purvis, who took it rather more seriously than Robert had expected, and who sent his own letter to the county land office in Tucson, and who began an investigation that moved at the specific pace of territorial law, which was not fast but was not stopping either. Briggs found out, as such men always find out, because there are very few secrets in small territories and powerful men have ears in many places. What Robert had not anticipated was the speed and directness of Briggs's response. It was the 2nd week of October. Elvira was at the ranch, as she often was on Saturdays, sitting with Marisla in the kitchen while Robert and Ernesto went over the fall cattle figures. The knock at the front door was loud enough to carry through the house. Robert answered it himself. Dalton Briggs was a large man, not fat but broad, with gray at his temples and the kind of permanent outdoor tan that went bone deep and never left. He had 2 of his men behind him, which Robert noted without reacting to it. Briggs himself had the look of a man who had arranged his face into reasonableness on top of something that was not reasonable at all. "Covington," he said. "Briggs," Robert said, and did not move from the doorway or invite him in. "I hear you've been looking into some old land records," Briggs said. The tone was conversational, the eyes were not. "I've been looking into a lot of things," Robert said. "I wanted to come and speak to you directly, man to man, clear some air. I think there may have been some misunderstandings between us over the past year, and I'd like to put them behind us." "Is that so?" "I've been making offers on your land because I need to expand. That's business. But I want you to know that the difficulties you've experienced on your fence lines, that's not something I've had any hand in." Briggs spread his hands in a gesture of openness that was one of the least convincing things Robert had seen in recent memory. "Fence gutters are a problem for everyone in this county. They do seem to target specific people's fences," Robert said pleasantly. Something tightened around Briggs's eyes. "I think you're a man who's under a lot of financial pressure right now, and I think that pressure makes some things look like malice that are just circumstance. I'd like to make you one more offer for this property. A generous one. Enough to clear your debts and buy something smaller and start clean." "I'm not interested," Robert said. "You might want to think about it." "I have thought about it. The answer is no. And Dalton, I'd suggest you look very carefully at your own legal standing before you come back here with any more offers, because the ground you're standing on right now is a good deal less stable than it looks." Briggs looked at him for a long time. Then he said, "That sounds like a threat." "It sounds like advice," Robert said. "What you do with it is your business." Briggs left. Robert watched the 3 horses go down his front drive and around the corner toward the road, and then he went back inside, and Elvira was standing in the kitchen doorway with her arms folded and an expression that was assessing and calm. "I heard most of that," she said. "He knows we're looking into the web deed," Robert said. "What does he do now?" "He either backs off or he escalates." Robert sat down heavily in the chair that was becoming, over the weeks, his chair. "I don't know which." "Briggs is not a man who's accustomed to being outmaneuvered." "Then we don't give him time to make a new plan," Elvira said, and sat down across from him, and they spent the next 2 hours working out what that meant. What it meant was a trip to Tucson. Robert went in the 3rd week of October, taking Ernesto with him and carrying Mrs. Garcia's letter and his own documentation of the fence-cutting incidents and the detailed account of the unusual conversations at the bank. He spent 2 days in the county seat speaking to the land registrar's office and to a territorial attorney named James Hartwell, who was thin and precise, and looked at the web deed documentation with an expression that grew increasingly satisfied. "This is enough to cloud his title to the eastern parcel," Hartwell said, "and if his title to that parcel is in dispute, then the collateral arrangements he's made against it become very interesting to the banks he's used them with." He tapped the papers. "This doesn't ruin the man overnight, but it takes his teeth out for a while, long enough for you to get your November payment in and get past his immediate leverage." "How long before the land office moves on this?" 4 to 6 weeks for the formal challenge process, but the filing is public record the moment it goes in. He'll know within days. Robert filed the challenge. He sent Mrs. Garcia a proper letter of thanks and a note explaining what would happen next and what she might receive in terms of fair compensation from the resolution of the title dispute, which Hartwell had confirmed could be substantial. He rode back to Redemption Creek on a Thursday evening, tired from the trail, and cleaner inside himself than he had felt in a long time. He went to Elvira before he went home. She was on the porch when he rode up, as if she had been expecting him, which she probably had been, because she had a way of knowing things about his likely movements that he found both slightly uncanny and enormously comforting. She came off the porch steps and stood at his gate, and when he dismounted she looked at him closely, reading his face the way she had learned to read his face. "It went well," she said. It was not a question. "It went well," he confirmed. She put her hand on his arm, on the sleeve of his jacket, just briefly, just for a moment, a touch that was clean and warm and said something neither of them had said aloud yet. Then she let go and said, "Come inside and eat something. You look like you've been on the trail all day." "I've been on the trail all day," he said. "Then come inside and eat something," she said again, as if the matter were perfectly settled, and it was. They ate at her kitchen table, and he told her everything about Tucson, and she listened and asked sharp questions, and the lamplight was gold on the table between them. When the meal was done and the dishes were stacked, she made coffee and they sat with it for a while, and the conversation wound down from business into something quieter. "I've been thinking," she said, in the tone she used when she'd been thinking about something for a while and had decided it was time to say it. "About what?" She turned her cup in her hands. "About permanence, about what I want to build here, whether this life here in this house, in this place is what I mean to make of it." She paused. "And about you. And what you are to me now, and what I would like you to be." He was very still. His heart was doing something that was not calm. "Elvira," he said. "I don't say things I haven't thought through," she said. "You know that about me by now." "I know that about you," he agreed. "So when I say that you have become the most important person in my life in this place, I have thought it through and I am certain of it." She looked at him. "And when I say that the shape of the future I am imagining is one that has you in it, I have thought that through too." He got up from his chair. He moved around the kitchen table to where she was sitting and crouched down so their eyes were level, and he took her hand, both her hands, in his. "The shape of the future I'm imagining has you in it too," he said. "It has had you in it since before I was honest enough with myself to admit it. Since you stopped by the fence line and listened to me sing," she said, and there was a small curved smile at the corner of her mouth, but her eyes were very serious. "Since before that," he said. "Since I heard your name from Bess McCready and stored it away without knowing why." She turned her hands over so that she was holding his as much as he was holding hers, and they stayed like that for a moment, and the lamplight held everything gently. He kissed her forehead first, because that was where the moment asked him to go, and she closed her eyes, and then he straightened up and she stood up, and he kissed her properly, and she kissed him back, and it was like the feeling at the end of a long journey when you come over a rise and see the lights of where you were going all along, and everything makes sense suddenly, that had been requiring too much effort to hold together. They stood in her kitchen for a while afterward, and she put her head against his chest and he kept his arms around her, and neither of them said anything for a long time because the moment was complete and words would have been redundant. "I'm going to ask you something," he said eventually, "and you can take whatever time you need with the answer." "Ask," she said against his chest. "Marry me," he said. "Not tomorrow, not because of anyone else's timetable, but marry me, Elvira. Come to the ranch and help me build it. Let me build alongside whatever you're building. Let this be what it already is." She was quiet for long enough that he began to wonder if he had miscalculated, but then he felt her smile against his shirt. "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes. Robert, it has been yes for a while." "Then why did you take a moment to answer?" "Because I wanted to enjoy having been asked," she said. "I've been waiting for you to say it, and I wanted to feel the full weight of it before I answered." He laughed. It was a real laugh, not performed, not polite, the kind that comes from somewhere genuine, and she felt it through his chest and made a sound that was also a laugh, and they held each other in her lamplight kitchen on a Thursday evening in October, and outside the Arizona night was full of stars. The news of their engagement moved through Redemption Creek with the speed that happy news moves through small places, which is to say immediately and everywhere at once. Bess McCready looked when Robert came in the following week as if she might actually cry, which she would have strongly denied if accused of it. Tom Aldridge shook Robert's hand with both of his and said Mrs. Holloway was a remarkable woman, which he had established his opinion of previously. Marisla Salazar said, in her straightforward way, "Finally," and went back to what she was doing, and Ernesto shook Robert's hand with quiet warmth and said nothing because Ernesto's warmth was in the grip, not the words. November 1st arrived, and the payment was made, and the cattlemen's bank received it without incident, and the manager, Robert noted, avoided his eyes when they stood at the counter together, which told him something about whose interest the manager had been serving. He filed that away. The land office challenge to the Briggs title on the web parcel moved through its processes. In the second week of November, with the formal challenge on public record and the territorial attorney active in Tucson, Dalton Briggs did something no one had quite expected. He made a settlement offer to Mrs. Corazon Garcia, a real one, a financial acknowledgement of what the Webb homestead land had been worth in 1882 and what it had appreciated to since. He did not admit wrongdoing in any document, which was careful lawyering, but the payment was substantial, and it went to Mrs. Garcia in Santa Fe, and she wrote Robert a letter that contained the phrase, "God bless you and your intended," and which Elvira read and folded carefully and kept. Briggs made no more offers on the Covington spread. The fence cutting stopped. The two men Ernesto had identified as Briggs's drifters were not seen in the county again. What Briggs was dealing with in terms of his own financial arrangement with his banks remained his own business, and Robert was not inclined to press it further now that the immediate threat was neutralized. He had not set out to ruin the man. He had set out to make ruining him the less attractive option, and that had worked. Sheriff Purvis came by in December and said he had been looking into the brush fire in June with the new information from the fence-cutting investigation, and that he had not found sufficient evidence to bring charges, but that certain individuals had been made aware that they were being watched carefully. Robert accepted this with the equanimity of a man who had learned to take what the law could give and secure what it couldn't by other means. They married in January of 1889. The ceremony was at the small church in Redemption Creek, performed by the minister who had been in the town for 20 years and who had a gift for the kind of ceremony that meant what it said. It was not elaborate. Elvira wore a dress of deep green wool that Marisla had helped her make, and she carried dried winter flowers from her own garden because they were what she had grown herself, and that mattered to her. Robert wore his good black coat and his best boots, and he stood at the front of that church and watched her come down the aisle on Tom Aldridge's arm, because she had no family in the territory and Tom had been a consistent friend. And when she reached him and looked at him, the expression on her face was something he had not seen before, completely open, all her usual careful distance gone, just Elvira looking at him across the space between them without protection. He thought later that this was the real gift of it, not the ceremony, not the words, though the words were good. It was that look, the look of a woman who had been frightened for 5 years and had chosen not to be frightened anymore. He said his vows in a clear voice and meant every word without qualification. She said hers looking directly at him, not at her hands or the minister or the middle distance, directly at him, and her voice was steady, and her eyes were full of a feeling so large he could feel it from where he stood as a kind of warmth. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister said, and Bess McCready in the front pew made a small sound that she would have described as a cough, and everyone else understood as exactly what it was. They had a wedding supper at the ranch, which Rosa had been planning with barely contained enthusiasm since October, and which involved more food than 20 people could reasonably eat, and more people than 20, because word of a wedding supper in the county brings people from considerable distances in the winter when there are few other occasions. It was warm and loud, and full of things being passed across tables and children, weaving between adult legs and fiddle music, coming from the corner, where 2 of Robert's hands had instruments and opinions about how to use them. Elvira sat beside him the whole evening with her hand sometimes on the table near his, and sometimes on his arm, and occasionally, when she thought no one was watching, her head briefly against his shoulder in a gesture so natural and so private that it caught his breath every time. When the last guests had gone and Rosa had gone to her own quarters beaming in a way she would also have denied, They sat together by the fire in the main room of the ranch house, and Elvira had her feet tucked up under her on the sofa in the way she always did when she was comfortable, and he had his arm around her, and the house was quiet around them. "Tell me what you're thinking," she said. "That this feels like something I might be too grateful for," he said, "and that I want to earn it." She turned and looked at him. "You already have," she said. "That's not how it works. You don't earn love in advance. You show up for it daily. You've already been showing up." "Since before the squash," he said. "Since before the squash," she confirmed and smiled, and it was the smile she had when something pleased her genuinely rather than socially, the one that reached her eyes. The spring that followed was the best one the ranch had seen in 3 years. The drought broke not dramatically, not in a single torrential event, but steadily, a wet February giving way to a rainy March, and the grass coming up green and thick in April in ways that made Ernesto look at the south pasture with an expression of profound personal satisfaction. The herd recovered. The new calves were strong. The financial figures that Robert went over every Sunday morning with Elvira, because she had insisted on understanding the full picture of the business she was now part of, and she was better with numbers than he had initially realized, moved steadily in the right direction. Elvira kept her kitchen garden and expanded it, and within 2 seasons, it was supplying not just her own household but trading with Marisla and selling modest quantities to Bess's store. She also, as she had considered, picked up work at the Redemption Creek School when the spring term opened, and a second teacher was needed for the older students. She taught 4 mornings a week, reading and arithmetic, and a certain quality of rigorous expectation that the older students found initially alarming and eventually formative, if the ones who thanked her years later were any evidence. She also sang. Not at first, not in the house where he could hear her, because old habits of privacy are slow to shift. But gradually, as the spring came on and the days lengthened, and the sense of safety she had been building inside herself grew more settled and structural, he would hear her. In the kitchen in the mornings, in the garden in the late afternoon, sometimes on the porch in the evenings, quietly, to herself, the same way she had been singing by the cottonwood trees on the morning that had changed everything. He never interrupted it. He never called attention to it in ways that would make her self-conscious. But once in May, she was in the kitchen singing while he came in through the back door from the barn, and she heard him and stopped, and he said very gently, "Don't stop." And she looked at him for a moment and then finished the song, looking at him the whole time, and it was different from either singing to herself alone or performing for an audience. It was something between the two, something she was choosing to give him, and it was the most intimate thing anyone had ever offered him in his life. "Your mother's song," he said when she finished. "She'd have liked you," Elvira said. "She liked honest men. She didn't encounter enough of them." He moved into the kitchen and put his arms around her from behind, and she leaned back against him, and they stood like that for a moment in the May morning light. In July of 1889, Elvira told him she was carrying their child. She told him the way she told him everything, directly, clearly, looking at him, no drama or preamble. She said, "I am going to have a baby in December." And his response was a silence that lasted approximately 3 seconds before he picked her up, which was not a thing she had expected, and which she expressed vocally with a sound that was partly surprise and partly laughter, and he set her back down carefully and held her face in his hands and looked at her. "December," he said. "December," she said. "Are you well?" "Perfectly well. I've been to see the doctor in town. He says everything looks as it should." He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her hair, in the slightly overwhelmed way of a man whose happiness is temporarily outrunning his composure, and she laughed properly now and held his wrists. "I hoped you'd be pleased," she said. "Pleased is too small a word," he said. "Elvira," he stopped, finding language inadequate, which was rare enough for a man who generally could find the words. "Thank you," he said, which was also inadequate but was what he had. "We did this together," she said. "Thank us both." The child was born in December 1889, 3 days before Christmas, during a cold snap that frosted the windows of the ranch house and sent Rosa into a state of organized maternal readiness that involved boiling significant quantities of water and numerous blankets, and a level of general supervision that Robert was extremely grateful for. The baby was a boy. He was born just after dawn, as the frostlight was coming through the bedroom window and making the room pale and sharp. And when he cried his first cry, Robert, who had been asked to wait in the hall and had declined and had stayed in the corner of the room instead, put his hand over his mouth and did not make a sound for a moment because there was too much feeling in him for it to come out safely. Elvira held the boy against her chest and looked at him with the particular expression of new parents, which is recognition, seeing someone you know in the face of someone you have never met. She looked at Robert. Her eyes were bright and tired and full of something that was not just happiness, which is a shallow vessel, but joy, which is the kind that has foundations. "Hello," she said to the baby. The baby, who had no opinion on the subject yet, closed his eyes. "He looks like you," Robert said, coming to sit on the edge of the bed, reaching out to touch the small head with one careful finger. "He looks like himself," Elvira said, "as he should." "What do we call him?" She had thought about this. He could tell. "James," she said, "for no particular tradition, just because it suits him. James Robert Covington." "James," he said, testing the name. It settled easily. "James Robert Covington." He looked at his wife, at his son, at the frostlit morning. "Merry Christmas," he said, a little helplessly. She smiled. "Merry Christmas, Robert." Rosa appeared in the doorway, having given them 3 minutes of privacy, which was her limit, took one look at the scene, made the sign of the cross with enormous satisfaction, and came in to take charge of things in the gentle and comprehensive way that Rosa always took charge of things. James grew. He grew with the peculiar speed that babies have, which is disorienting to everyone around them. By the time the winter of 1890 gave way to a warm spring, he had brown eyes like his mother and a cert set to his jaw that Marisla said with authority was all his father, and a laugh that surprised everyone who heard it by being larger than anything that small should produce. The ranch grew too. Robert extended the south pasture fence and brought in a new bull from a breeder in New Mexico that Ernesto had spent 3 months selecting through correspondence. Elvira's kitchen garden had by now expanded into what was effectively a small productive enterprise, and she had expanded her teaching from 4 mornings to full days in the fall and winter terms, and she had also begun writing. He had noticed the papers on her kitchen table the very first day, and had never read them without permission, and now he was permitted. And what she was writing was smart and careful and original, and he had said so with specificity that had made her look at him with an expression of mingled pleasure and embarrassment. "I'm not sure it amounts to anything useful," she said about it. "It amounts to whatever you decide to make of it," he said. That's not a limitation. The title dispute over the web parcel had resolved itself in early 1890, a judgment from the territorial court confirming the original title issue, Mrs. Garcia receiving her settlement, and Briggs's title to the property being put in a conditional status that was manageable for him, but stripped him of the most aggressive expansion capacity he had planned. He was still a powerful man in the county. He would remain one. But he was a power with limits now, clearly understood limits, and he directed his ambitions eastward in subsequent years, toward properties that had no complications attached to their ownership. He and Robert never became friendly. They were civil when their paths crossed in town or at county meetings, in the way that men who have tested each other and found the test conclusive are civil, with a particular quality of mutual recognition that required no warmth to be respectful. Robert did not forgive the fence cutting or the brush fire or the bank arrangements. But he also did not spend energy he didn't have on bitterness when there was better work to do. In the spring of 1891, Elvira discovered she was carrying their second child. She told him in the garden on a May afternoon, between rows of the beans she had been growing since her first season in the county, and his response was considerably more measured than it had been the first time, still warm, still full of everything that was in him, but with the steadiness of a man who had once already watched this woman carry and birth a child, and had come out the other side of that experience knowing what it was to be afraid for someone you could not protect with your own body. "You're worried," she said, reading him exactly. "I'm not worried," he said. "I'm aware. The same thing in your vocabulary." He sat down on the garden bench right there among the beans, and she sat beside him. "You know why he stopped. If anything were to, nothing is going to," she said firmly. "I am strong and healthy, and the doctor is 8 miles away, and Marisla has delivered half the babies in this county informally. James arrived safely. This one will too. You're certain." "I'm not a woman who trades in certainty," she said. "You know that, but I am making you a reasonable assessment, and I need you to trust it." He looked at her, and at the garden around them, and at the ranch buildings beyond the garden fence, and at the sky, which was the enormous impartial blue sky of the Arizona Territory. He took her hand. "I trust it," he said. "The second child was born in November of 1891, and it was a girl. She arrived in the early evening with considerably less drama than James had managed with his dawn arrival, and she was small and dark-haired, and had a quality of absolute determined presence from her first moments that Elvira said, with tired certainty, meant she was going to run whatever room she occupied for the rest of her life. "She's like you," Robert said, looking at the small face. "She's like herself," Elvira said again and smiled. "But I hope so." They named her Clara. Clara Elvira Covington, and from the moment James was brought in to meet her and crouched down with his 2-year-old seriousness to look at his sister's face, the dynamic of the household shifted around this small new center of gravity. The years that followed were not without difficulty. The West in the early 1890s was changing in ways that were not always comfortable. The closing of the open range, the pressure on small and medium ranches from the consolidation happening everywhere, the hard winter of 1893 that killed cattle across 3 territories and put half a dozen of Robert's neighbors out of business. He weathered it, partly through good management and partly through the financial conservatism that Elvira's involvement in the ranch books had reinforced, and partly through a willingness to adapt, diversifying beyond cattle into some sheep grazing, and a small hay operation that turned out to have better margins in the difficult years than pure cattle ever had. Elvira's writing found its form in those years too. What had been scattered papers and private thoughts became, with the encouragement of James Hartwell in Tucson, who had read something she had shown him and expressed genuine interest, a series of articles for the Tucson Citizen on the practical and legal situation of women property owners in the Arizona Territory. They were clear and specific and grounded in real legal cases, and they ran in 1892 and again in 1893, and the response to them was substantial, not universally positive, because nothing honest ever is, but consequential. The land office in Tucson invited her to speak at a meeting about homestead laws. She went with Robert beside her, and she spoke clearly and without apology, and he sat in the audience and watched her and felt the specific pride that comes from being loved by someone extraordinary and knowing it. Bess McCready framed the Tucson Citizen article in the general store. It was the first thing you saw when you walked in. By 1895, the Covington Ranch was one of the most stable operations in the county. Not the largest, but the soundest. The kind of place that attracted young men looking for honest work because the wages were consistent and the conditions were fair, and the family that ran it had a reputation that had been built piece by piece out of the choices they had made in hard moments. James, at 5, was interested in every animal on the property with an intensity that Ernesto found deeply flattering, since the boy followed him everywhere with grave and specific questions. Clara, at 3, had opinions about most things and expressed them in clear, unqualified terms, which was familiar. Rosa, who had turned 60 and showed no interest in slowing down, had absorbed both children into her domain as completely as she had absorbed their parents, and she could often be found reading to James in the kitchen or allowing Clara to assist with baking in ways that were more sentimental than practical. One evening in the late summer of 1895, Robert and Elvira were sitting on the porch of the ranch house after the children had been put to bed. The nights were cooling earlier now than they had in the worst drought years, and there was a good smell in the air from the recent rain, and the stars were thick and clear overhead. Elvira had her feet tucked up under her on the porch chair, as she had on 10,000 evenings, and she had a cup of tea and the particular quality of settled peace that had taken her years to arrive at and that he cherished every time he saw it. "Are you content?" he asked her. She looked at him. She thought about it, which was her way. She did not give quick answers to real questions. "I am more than content," she said. "I am grateful in a way I didn't know how to be for a long time." Gratitude requires a certain amount of safety before it can function properly, and I didn't have that safety for a long time. She turned her cup. "I think contentment is what happens when you've built what you meant to build and you can see it around you, and I can see it." He reached across and took her hand the way he had in 10,000 versions of this evening, and she held on. "I heard you singing today," he said. "When I came in from the east pasture, you were in the kitchen. You came in quietly. I always come in quietly when you're singing," he said, "so I can hear the whole song." She looked at him with an expression that was full and warm and private. "You could just ask me to sing to you," she said. "I know," he said, "but there's something particular about the way you sing when you don't know you're being heard. Something true in it." "I know I'm being heard now," she said. "I've known for a long time. Cormac's hoofbeats are not actually subtle, Robert," he laughed. "I don't mind," she said, "any more. I don't mind if you hear the truest things." She looked out at the stars. "I think that's what love is, really. The willingness to let someone hear the song you only sang to yourself." He looked at her for a long moment. In the years since that morning by the cottonwood trees, he had come to understand her by degrees, and the understanding was always deepening, always finding new rooms in the house of who she was, and he expected it would continue to do so for however many years were given to them, and he wanted every one of those years with a clarity that had not diminished at all with time. "I should have knocked on your fence that morning," he said, "instead of just sitting there listening for 11 minutes. She turned to look at him. "You counted." "I counted." She shook her head slowly, but she was smiling. "What would you have said if you'd knocked?" He thought about it honestly. "Probably something about the fence line," he said, "because I would have been too surprised by you to say anything true. You found the truth eventually. You helped." She leaned over and kissed him, there on the porch in the summer night, with the stars overhead and the ranch quiet around them and the children asleep inside. It was a long, unhurried kiss, the kind that has no urgency because it has no doubt attached to it, and when it ended she settled back and kept her hand in his. A year later, in the summer of 1896, she told him there would be a third child. James was 6 and Clara was 4, and when James was told he was going to have another sibling, he accepted it with the equanimity of a child who had already learned that the world kept generating interesting things. Clara asked 3 specific and reasonable questions, and then announced that she hoped it would be a girl, but that she supposed a boy would do. It was another boy. He arrived in February of 1897, as healthy and loud as his brother had been, and they named him William after no one in particular, because the name suited him and none of the others had. The night after William was born, when Elvira was sleeping, and the baby was in the cradle that had served all 3 children and would likely serve more after them, Robert sat alone in the kitchen for a while with a cup of coffee and the particular stillness of a very full heart. He thought about a morning 6 years ago when he had been riding a fence line with 37 problems in his head, and a note of music had come through cottonwood leaves and stopped him cold. He thought about what would have happened if he had not stopped, if he had ridden on, if Cormac had not gone still, If the wind had been different and the sound had not carried. He thought about all the things that had had to be true simultaneously for him to hear her singing, and he decided that the word for that was not luck, exactly, though luck was part of it. The word was grace, the unearned gift that lands on you when you have not been careful enough to avoid it. He went back to bed. Elvira stirred when he came in and said, without opening her eyes, "Everything all right? Everything is perfect," he said. She made a small, satisfied sound and settled back into sleep, and he lay beside her and listened to the ranch settle around them in the winter night, and thought that he had been given more than he deserved and intended to spend the rest of his life being equal to it. The spring of 1897 brought good rains and strong grass and a new fence along the east pasture that Ernesto had overseen with his characteristic thoroughness. It also brought, on a particular Tuesday afternoon, the sound of Elvira Holloway Covington in her kitchen garden, singing to herself while she moved between the rows, her voice low and clear and unhurried, her hands in the soil, the baby William asleep in the shade a few feet away in the wooden cradle that Robert had moved outside for the afternoon. He was coming in from the barn and he stopped at the garden gate. He had heard her sing hundreds of times now. He had heard her sing in the kitchen and on the porch and late at night when she thought he was asleep. He had heard her sing to their children. He had heard her sing in the church on Christmas morning with her voice full and unguarded. But still, when he came on her singing when she was alone and absorbed in the work of her own hands, and the song was coming from wherever inside her songs lived, he stopped and he listened. He stood at the garden gate for 5 minutes. The song moved through the afternoon air and through him, and he let it do what it always did, which was to open something in his chest that stayed open only for this, that required precisely this, that no other thing in the world accomplished. Then she heard the gate creak. He had meant to oil it and kept forgetting, and she looked over her shoulder, and she saw him standing there, and she did not stop. She turned back to her garden and kept singing, and the last notes of the song were directed at him over her shoulder as clearly as anything she had ever said to him directly, and when the song ended she stood up and brushed the dirt from her hands and turned around. "How long?" she asked. 5 minutes, he said, "give or take." "You never oil that gate," she said. "I know," he said. "I suspect you do it on purpose. I suspect you know exactly when I'm there," he said, "and sing on regardless." She looked at him across the garden rows, with the spring afternoon light on her face and the baby sleeping in the shade and the ranch spread out around them in all its familiar dimensions. And she smiled, the real smile, the one that was just hers, just for him, the one he had been watching arrive and deepen and become more itself with every year. "Come and help me with these beans," she said. He opened the gate and walked toward her across the garden she had planted from the beginning with her own careful hands, in the territory she had chosen, beside the man she had chosen, in the life she had built from the ground up after losing the one that had been built against her. And he rolled up his sleeves and crouched down beside her in the row, and they worked together in the afternoon, and she hummed as they worked. And the sound of it was the most solid, most true, most homecoming thing he had ever heard in his life. That evening after supper, after the children had been settled and Rosa had gone home and the ranch was quiet, they sat on the porch together in the familiar way, her feet tucked under her, his arm around her, the Arizona night spread out before them wide and deep and full of stars. "Tell me something," he said. "What? Something you haven't told me yet." She was quiet for a moment, thinking, which he loved. Then she said, "When I came here to this county on the stage from Tucson, I had a list. Written down on paper, all the things I wanted my life to be, the conditions I needed it to meet before I would feel like I had rebuilt something real. I had it very specifically cataloged." She paused. "I lost the paper somewhere in the first month. I think I used it to write down a seed order and then forgot which side was which." "What was on it?" he asked. "Safety," she said. "Work that was my own, a place that felt like mine, not borrowed or conditional, honesty with myself and whoever else I let close, the ability to sing in my own house without being frightened of what someone would make of it." She turned and looked at him. "I got everything on the list," she said. and considerably more than the list had thought to ask for. He pulled her closer. She came easily, naturally, the way people come to things they have chosen with their whole selves. The stars overhead were the same stars that had been there the night he had ridden home from her porch after hearing her say yes, and the same stars that had been there on every night between then and this one, and would be there on every night still to come. "Elvira," he said. "Robert," she said, in the voice that was his name in a different meaning than it had anywhere else. The night held them, and the ranch held them, and the life they had made held them, all of it intact and whole and resolved, the fears that had been faced, the debts that had been paid, the dangers that had been answered, the love that had arrived uninvited and stayed because they had both been willing, finally, to open the door fully and let it all the way in. And sometimes, still, on an ordinary morning or an ordinary afternoon, one of the children would hear her singing in the kitchen or the garden and would stop and stand quietly, listening without interrupting, because even the children understood without being told that there was something in the sound of it that was not for performance but for truth, and that the truth of it was beautiful, and that it deserved to be heard with care. And Robert, when he heard them standing there listening, would feel something compound and grateful move through him, because there had been a morning once when he had not known her at all, only heard her voice through the leaves of cottonwood trees and known, in the way certain things announce themselves beyond argument, that his life had just divided into before and after. And after, with every year that followed, had been everything.